What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. So, a couple of months ago, I noticed that it was about time for me to update my top 10 by position listing. Of course, I started at the point guard position. I've done shooting guards, small forwards, and I completed power forwards. I think it was last week. So now I'm in the last position, the center position. Of course, for much of NBA history, the center position was the most important position. I know that sounds foreign to younger fans of the game, where you would get the impression it's perimeter positions, like in particular the point guard. But from the beginnings of the NBA all the way up until I'd say at least the 90s, the center position was the foundation position for starting a franchise. You know, you went inside out rather than today where everything is perimeter orientated, or even in the 2000s where it started becoming more outside in, you know. So to me, for some reason, it's not as difficult for me to list my centers as it is for other positions. Even though there have been a lot of great centers, to me, there's like generally speaking, there's a top 10 centers listing that most people have. There might be some differences in how you rank them, but it pretty much, to me, I think this is the consensus when it comes to top 10 centers. I think most people will agree in some order that they'll have these guys in there. Okay, maybe one or two exceptions. Also, I want to mention that I have added in the playlist an updated top 10 by positions playlist of these more recent videos. So at number 10, I have Patrick Ewing. All right. Now, Patrick Ewing is in most people's eyes the greatest center in Knicks history. Some will say Willis Reed. He did win two championships. But I think Patrick Ewing was a more accomplished overall player. I think he was a more dominant center than Willis Reed. Uh, Ewing did not have the Hall of Fame pieces that Willis Reed would have with him. You know what I'm saying? Um, let's not forget Willis Reed played with guys like Walt Clyde Frazier and Earl the Pearl Monroe. He, of course, played with Dave DeBusschere, Jerry Lucas. Um, even though he wasn't, in my opinion, a Hall of Famer as a pro, but Bill Bradley, who's a Hall of Famer maybe more because of his collegiate career, and so on. But Patrick Ewing has become kind of synonymous with underachiever. Um, him more so than maybe even Charles Barkley. You know, Charles Barkley does give credit for his individual dominance. Patrick Ewing, I think it has to do with the fact that look, Charles Barkley was a really good college player, but Patrick Ewing is one of the great collegiate players of all times. Okay, I mean one of the great collegiate players of all times, probably a top 15 all time college player. So with such pomp and such expectations coming into the NBA. You know what I'm saying? There was one particular analyst that said something to the effect of, we've had the Mikan era, and we've had the Russell era, we've had the Kareem era, now we're going to have the Ewing era. So with so much expectations behind him, that's why some people see his career as a bit of a disappointment. But I will say this. Um, no one envisioned Michael Jordan. Um, even when Jordan was out of the league, and people thought Ewing might finally win a title, Elijah Wan got no. Elijah Wan peaked at the wrong time for Patrick Ewing. And then there are many who will say, well, Patrick Ewing didn't. Even Charles Oakley recently said this, that One of the reasons why they never won titles or did as well as they did the New York Knicks in the 1990s is because Patrick Ewing didn't raise his game uh, to that adequate level to take his team over the top. And from watching Patrick Ewing, I kind of understand where he's coming from with that. There have been some games, excuse me, where Patrick Ewing has raised his level of play, but for the most part, it's like Ewing played at a high level, but he didn't go an extra level. He didn't go in that extra gear that you would see with superstars of that era. Other superstars like Olajuwon, of course, in '95 playoffs. Jordan, of course, you know, frequently throughout his career. Charles Barkley at times. Shaq finally, with the championship years, raising his level of play. Ewing kind of didn't do that. And, it's mirrored in his regular season playoff stats. I think during his playoff career, he averaged something like 21 points, uh, close to 10 rebounds, maybe 2.5 blocks or something like that. Great, fine overall number, especially for someone who played well over 1,000 games. He's only Nick to play over 1,000 games. But then you look at his playoff numbers, and it's the mirror image: 21 points, 9.5, close to 10 rebounds, 2.5 blocks. Um, he didn't raise his level of play enough, considering he did not have a super team around him. You know what I'm saying? Ewing didn't have another superstar or Hall of Fame level player around him. He had a lot of really good pieces at times, but not another Hall of Fame level player. But he definitely is one of the great centers in the history of the NBA. And he did get a lot of unnecessary hate. I think sometimes it came from reasons that were kind of ignorant, to say the least. You know what I'm saying? When Patrick Ewing was born in 1962 in Kingston, Jamaica, as a child, he was very good at playing cricket and soccer. When Ewing was a child, he moved to the United States and joined his family in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was there where he learned to play the game of basketball. And in just a few years, with his growing height and size and athleticism, he became a very good, outstanding, and dominant player. And that's one thing I noticed with a lot of these centers, or big men like Ewing and Tim Duncan, another one, Olajuwon, um, that played overseas, that were from overseas. Their culture was more dominated by other sports, but when they were introduced to the game of basketball, them being natural athletes, it didn't take them that long to adjust and be dominant players. Unfortunately, even at this time, Patrick Ewing, due to his appearance, was often the target of racially fueled taunts and jeers from hostile away crowds. After high school, Ewing focused on his collegiate career, and he received offers from different universities. He even considered joining the University of North Carolina. However, what changed his mind with that situation was when he saw a nearby Ku Klux Klan rally being held not too far from campus, and that changed his mind. And ultimately, he decided to go to Georgetown University and play under the late great John Thompson. Now, one of the things that people forget about Ewing's collegiate career is that, with the exception of one year, Patrick Ewing and the Georgetown Hoyas went to the championship game every year. As a freshman in 1981-82, Ewing and the Georgetown Hoyas played against the team that he once considered joining, the University of North Carolina, in the championship game. And that was the same game where Michael Jordan hit the game winner, what proved to be the game winner, but the game truly slipped away from Georgetown when Freddie Brown mistakenly threw a pass that was directed to the opposing player, James Worthy. The next season, this was the only year that the Hoyas missed the championship game, although there was a memorable game during the season between Patrick Ewing and Ralph Sampson, which was dubbed the game of the decade. During the 83-84 season, Ewing led Georgetown to the Big East regular season championship, the Big East tournament championship, and another number one seed in the NCAA tournament. This was the year where in the national championship game, Ewing and Georgetown prevailed with an 84-75 victory against his future nemesis, Houston, University of Houston, and Akeem Olajuwon. Ewing was named the tournament's most outstanding player. His last year at Georgetown, 84-85, the Georgetown Hoyas once again made it all the way to the national championship game. And this is when, Patrick Ewing was being touted as one of the great college players of all time. And they went to the championship game, but this is when they were upsetted by Villanova, by the Villanova Wildcats, who shot an unbelievable 79% from the floor, which denied Ewing and Georgetown back-to-back titles. At the conclusion of the season, Ewing was awarded the Naismith Player of the Year Award and the Associated Press Player of the Year. Now, it was shortly thereafter, of course, that Ewing was made available for the 1985 draft, a draft that many people feel was rigged. But look, um, everybody knows David Stern was a New York Knicks fan. You know what I'm saying? He grew up idolizing Harry Gallatin. Um, it is what it is. But New Yorkers didn't complain, and there were a lot of great expectations in the draft. Um, there was, at the time, this expectation of, well, look, we're going to have a team with Patrick Ewing and possibly Bernard King. And ultimately, due to Bernard King's injury, that didn't come to pass. But there was hope for New York Knicks fans because finally, for the first time in a decade, they had a franchise caliber player. The New York Knicks at that time they were used to being a contender in the NBA. Of course, at that time it had only been um, 12 years since they won their last championship. But after the decline of that team in the mid to late 70s, there had been a lot of bad years. Um, they had some promise, but oftentimes, whether it was drugs with a guy like Michael Ray Richardson, or whether it was injury with Bernard King, there was, you know, you know, there had been a lot of downs more than ups for New York Knicks fans at the time. But Patrick Ewing came aboard, and even though he did have somewhat of an injury marred rookie year, he was still voted Rookie of the Year and named to the NBA All Rookie Team. Excuse me, after averaging 20 points, 9 rebounds, and 2 blocks per game. Now, during the rest of the 1980s, the New York Knicks and Patrick Ewing would go through a carousel of coaches. Okay, um, whether you're talking about Larry Brown or whether you're talking about, I believe Rick Pitino coached that team one year, they were getting better, but they weren't, an upper echelon team in the Eastern Conference. At this time, the Eastern Conference was ruled by teams like the Boston Celtics, the Detroit Pistons. Uh, Philly was starting to fall apart at that time. The Cleveland Cavaliers were a rising team. The Chicago Bulls, of course. the New York Knicks were a team that generally won something like 36 games, maybe 38, 39, but they weren't a team that, you know, did anything more than miss, either just barely miss the playoffs or get swept in the first round. Um, it wasn't until the 1990s when Pat Riley arrived that the Knicks really began to turn the corner. And this team was totally different from, say, the team that, and their philosophy was different from the team that Pat Riley coached with the Lakers. Even though that core toughness was still there with the Lakers, it was covered up by the glitz and shine and you know and glad and glitter of Showtime. But make no mistake about it, the Lakers were at their core a gritty team. Without all of that, with the New York Knicks, we saw Pat Riley truly put his personality on this Knicks team. He saw what he had. He didn't have the most glamorous athletes, but what he did have was a bunch of gritty, tough, hard-nosed players. And that's the identity that that team took. Okay, they kind of took a page from the Detroit Pistons, in my opinion, and it worked for the New York Knicks. All right, in 1991-92, they won 51 games, and unexpectedly, they took the defending world champion Chicago Bulls to 7 games. And the very next year, the 92-93 season, they had the best record in the Eastern Conference. They won 60 games, which tied the franchise record, which was established back in the 1970s. And they had a 2-0 lead against the Chicago Bulls, which they did squander. Okay. One of the things I do wonder, I want to interject this right quick. One of the things I do wonder about Patrick Ewing is I wonder what would have happened if he had this team around him when he was a little bit younger. Because you got to remember, even as early as the 91-92 season, Patrick Ewing turned 30 that March. So he was never really in his prime. Ewing had been battling knee injuries and knee issues ever since college. And Ewing's best years, health wise, were in the late 80s. Even by the 1990s, Ewing was still dominant, but he wasn't the up and down, you know, uh, he wasn't the powerhouse that he was in the 80s. Even by then, he was starting to become more of a grounded, jump shooting type guy. I guess is basically what I'm trying to say. Um, but ultimately, the Chicago Bulls proved to be a thorn in Patrick Ewing's and the New York Knicks collective side. But then a window of opportunity came about when Michael Jordan retired in October of 1993. And many people said, okay, this is Patrick Ewing and the Knicks' chance to win a championship. Okay. Um, they went 57, I think, and 25 that season. Um, but even though Michael Jordan was no longer part of the program or part of the picture, a new foe emerged, that being Reggie Miller. All of a sudden now Reggie Miller comes out and he gives the Knicks a run for their money. And the Chicago Bulls, who many people felt was, hey, may not even make the playoffs this year, somehow they win 55 games. Why Phil Jackson didn't win Coach of the Year in '94, I still have no fucking idea. But the New York Knicks ultimately would get past the Chicago Bulls and get past the Pacers, and they made it to the NBA Finals. And to be honest with you, I thought the New York Knicks had a better team than Houston overall. And if Patrick Ewing had just played adequately, maybe averaged something like 24 points, 10, 12 rebounds. Even if he just shot 43, 44% from the floor, they would have won that championship series. Even though a lot of people put the blame on John Starks, and he did choose to have the worst game of his career at the wrong fucking time, Game 7 of the 1994 NBA Finals. But people forget that John Starks was the main reason why they were able to get to where they were anyway. You know what I'm saying? He had been playing really big for that team, I believe, before that game. But during the series, Patrick Ewing was severely outplayed by Olajuwon. I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I think Olajuwon averaged something like 25 points and 11 rebounds for the finals, which was not the prettiest finals to watch. I believe that's the first NBA Finals where no team scored 100 points in a game, or at least since the shot clock era. I think the first time that hadn't occurred. Um, Patrick Ewing only averaged 18 points per game during the 1994 NBA Finals, which famously was interrupted by the O.J. highway chase. And Ewing only shot 36% from the floor, which for a center is atrocious. Okay. And whether you want to say Ewing choked or not, I think the 1994 NBA Finals was a big hit on his legacy. Okay. It is. It's a big hit on his legacy. The very next year, 1994-95, that was the last year that Pat Riley was the head coach of that organization. And famously, during that season, I believe it was I can't remember what round that was. Was it the semis where they went against the Indiana Pacers again? They went 7 games, and Patrick Ewing ultimately missed a layup, which I believe would have won the game for them. And that was the last time Pat Riley coached the New York Knicks. And afterwards, you could see a perceptible decline in Patrick Ewing's game. Um, age had taken a toll on him. He still was one of the better centers in the NBA. At one point, you could argue in 93, 94, maybe he was the best center, top 2. But by 1996, 97, Ewing was probably like a top 5, top 6 center in the NBA. Interestingly enough, though, the 96-97 season was a renaissance season for the New York Knicks. They went 57-25. If it were not for injuries, they probably would have won more, something like 62 or 63 games. But there's some injuries down the stretch of that season. And it was that playoff series they had against the Miami Heat in the semis where they blew a 3-1 lead. And it was a fight that occurred, I believe, I think it was game 4 of that series, where there was a fight and players were ejected. Players that came off the bench were ejected. But everybody who's being fair and objective will tell you that the players who were punished, it severely impacted New York much more than Miami. And to me, that decided the series. It directly affected the series, and it's the main reason why New York blew that 3-1 lead to the Miami Heat and lost ultimately 4-3. Patrick Ewing tried valiantly in Game 7 after missing Game 6 due to suspension. But at the end of the day, his 38 points, I believe it was something like 17 rebounds, just weren't enough. During the 1997-98 season, in a game, I think it was December of 1997, in a game against Milwaukee, Ewing suffered the worst injury of his career. He landed awkwardly on his wrist, and he basically dislocated. To put it bluntly, from what I've read, he basically dislocated his wrist from his arm, totally. Like, I read that had he not had emergency surgery, there would have been permanent nerve damage to his wrist, and the tendons were ripped, the bone was completely fractured. His wrist was pretty much severed from his arm, pretty much. He came back in time to play in the playoffs, but ultimately, once again, they lost to the Indiana Pacers in the playoffs. And the next year, the 1999 season, Patrick Ewing was suffering from an Achilles injury. And even though the New York Knicks had that miracle run and made it all the way to the NBA Finals, Patrick Ewing was not really a part of that, and due to injury. And his last year was, I believe, the 99-2000 season. But by that time, Patrick Ewing really was done as a starter, really. After that, I believe he was traded to the Seattle Supersonics. And then afterward, I think the next year he played with the Orlando Magic, which I think was 2001, 2002 season. But by this time, Patrick Ewing was a backup and who was pretty much just, you could tell that, the writing was on the wall that it was over. And after that season, he retired. Now, one thing I do want to mention about Patrick Ewing is that he has two Olympic medals, two Olympic gold medals. In 1984, as an amateur, which was the next to last year that they allowed amateurs in the Olympics. He won in Los Angeles, and of course, he was part of the 1992 Dream Team in Barcelona. His resume: he's 11-time NBA All-Star. He was an All-NBA First Team in 1990, 6 times All-NBA Second Team, 3-time NBA All-Defensive Second Team. He was the 1985-86 Rookie of the Year. He was on the 85-86 NBA All-Rookie Team. His number 33 was retired by the New York Knicks. He was on the NBA's 50th anniversary All-Time Team. NCAA champion in 1984, of course. He was the NCAA Final Four Most Outstanding Player in 1984. National College Player of the Year in 1985. 3-time consensus First Team All-American, 83, 84, and 85. Twice Big East Player of the Year, 84, 85. 4-time Big East Defensive Player of the Year, 82, 83, 84, and 85. 3-time First Team All Big East, 83 to 85. Second Team All Big East, 82. Mr. Basketball USA, 1981. 2-time First Team Parade All American, 1980, 81. For his career, Patrick Ewing averaged 21 points, 9.8 rebounds, 2.4 blocks per game. That translated to 24,815 points, 11,617 rebounds, 2,894 blocks. What else do I want to say about Patrick Ewing? Patrick Ewing was a dominant defensive player. He was a great shot blocker. Um, he didn't have a plethora of moves, but he had about 3 or 4 reliable post moves that worked for him. He was, as he got older, he became an exceptional mid-range shooter. Although I thought sometimes as he got older, he relied on it too much. And one of the things I remember watching him, whenever whenever the Knicks would play the Bulls, I always would look for certain things with Patrick Ewing, right? And this is what I would look for. I would look to see how he would start the game. If Patrick Ewing started off with a head of steam and drove to the basket, drove around Longley and tried to be aggressive or something like that, or Bill Cartwright or Purdue, whoever, tried to go for, a dunk or a hand one, if he did anything that was an aggressive move to the basket, that kind of made my heart sick because I knew what type of mindset he would have. If he would start off shooting jumpers, and if he wasn't making them, especially, I would say to myself, okay, good. There was 2 things I always worry about with the Knicks: how Ewing started and how John Starks started as far as shooting from outside. Another thing about Patrick Ewing is that he was not the greatest passing big man. Okay, he had smallish hands, and one of the things that you will note from watching Patrick Ewing over the years is his tendency to shoot over a double team. You know what I'm saying? He did it all the time, and it was a low percentage shot, and I love when he did it. I'm just talking as a Bulls fan, right? But all in all, Patrick Ewing is one of the all-time great centers. Everybody has flaws, and tell me what you guys think.